Right off the top at 4, history made. The first talks between the U.S. and Cuba in Havana as the two try to normalize relations for the first time in 50 years. As they try to repair the relationship, Cuba is asking the U.S. to not only lift the embargo, but even to take it off the terror list. Local 10 News is the only South Florida station in Cuba right now, and my partner Calvin Hughes is right there live with the latest from Havana.
Lori, what a day it has been. History made between two nations trying to normalize ties for the first time in some 5 decades. And today we heard from both sides who say that today was productive. And today seemed to be the focus was on reopening the embassies in both Washington, D.C. and here in Havana. There are so many issues to overcome between two governments who haven't had diplomatic relations in more than 50 years. On the issue of democratic reforms, that might be the most challenging and complicated issue for the both Cuban government as well as the U.S. government. But the economic issues are issues that are interesting too as well, and I'll bring in my colleague here because the issue of commerce and trade, those are subjects that people are talking about here, and we're already seeing some form of change here. But there are only so many goods that you can take home with you. There's a cap on how much you can spend here in Cuba as a tourist.
Specifically cigars and alcohol. And what better way to talk about the story than to talk to a man who's in his 70s, was here, a young man when the revolution takes place. He makes cigars for a living. He's an artist at best. And here he is talking about his industry and what he hopes happens in Cuba when it comes to the economic situation.
Mi nombre es Arnaldo Alfonso Ibáñez.
He's 78 years old and knows a thing or two about cigars, the movement in his hands, how he places the tobacco leaves on top of each other.
60 años haciendo lo mismo.
Had not yet turned 16 when he started learning the art. So young, his mother would bring him lunch to work.
Y para mí este es un mundo muy maravilloso en el sentido de...
For me, he says, the world of cigars is a marvelous world. They say it's bad for you, but everything in excess is bad. The shop where he works is a couple doors down from where American and Cuban diplomats will decide how life may change for him.
¿Cómo va a cambiar el producto?
We asked if the product will change. What he calls the best tobacco in the world, he says will only get better. But he acknowledges those in his industry will have to get ready for the possible rise in demand after the recent changes that allow Americans to buy and bring back more Cuban goods.
Es una cosa muy buena para nuestro país.
Improving U.S.-Cuba relations, he says, will be good for Cubans and the world. This is a man who admits that he never thought he'd see this day come. But let's also talk about human rights again, because it's going to be such an important part of this conversation. Calvin, come in if you will and talk to us about some of the things happening tomorrow.
Well, we know Roberta Jacobson, the Assistant Secretary of State and the point person for these diplomatic discussions, will be sitting down and talking with dissidents today, and tomorrow she's going to hold a news conference, and of course we're going to talk with her about that as well.
They have views about the exercise of human rights in Cuba.
The one and only Local 10 speaking with Josefina Vidal Ferrero, the woman who led the Cuban delegation in historic diplomatic talks with the U.S. behind closed doors Thursday.
What happened in Ferguson that concerns Cuba, Ferguson, Missouri?
Police brutality. This is something you never see in Cuba.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Calvin Hughes, live in Panama City ahead of the Summit of the Americas, and it will mark the first time that Cuba will have a seat at the table, who you can see in this video as he's facing off with another protester. And during the fight, a Panamanian police officer hits Gutierrez over the head with what appears to be a black baton, knocking him to the ground. Here is where the fight took place, in front of the Cuban embassy. The fight spills out into the streets with some pro-Cuban government activists yelling out to Gutierrez and his crew, "You're bought, you're bought." Well, Lori, the summit is still a few hours from starting here. The inauguration ceremony begins at 7 o'clock in the convention center right behind me. But just a few moments ago, President Barack Obama arrived here at the convention center. He's on stage right now with Panamanian President Varela. But also making headlines today, as you talked about, Nicolas Maduro arriving here in Panama City with much fanfare, as you can see there, pumping his fist to our Local 10 cameras.
Our colleague Calvin Hughes is in Panama City tonight. He joins us live with our top story. Calvin.
President Obama.
Lori, there is a newspaper circulating here, and the headline says the Americas Unite, and there's a subheadline there that says Panama Summit to usher in new era of inter-American relations. And so that new era began tonight with a handshake between Presidents Barack Obama and Raul Castro. You're looking at the video here. The only words we could make out were both men saying to each other, "Hi, how are you?" or "Hola, ¿cómo estás?" But not to be left out of the spotlight was Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro, whose red carpet arrival left hundreds very upset. President Nicolas Maduro waved soon after appearing from the Sheraton Hotel in Panama City in front of a crush of cameras. Maduro's only response to our questions.
How are you?
Our local 10 chief photographer William Damas learned a first-hand lesson of being part of a media mob chasing Maduro.
Calvin Hughes is live in Panama with the latest, and Leanne Morejon has local reaction. We'll begin tonight, though, with Calvin.
Carlos, the 7th Summit of the Americas is officially over tonight. President Barack Obama left on Air Force One at just about 6:30 tonight. That's soon after meeting with President Castro for a one-hour bilateral meeting.
Local 10 exclusive. We are on the ground in Havana as historic change continues across the island. For the first time since diplomatic relations were restored, a prominent U.S. governor visits Cuba, talking big business. And people all over the island nation are casting ballots, including former President Fidel Castro himself, who you see right here. So is there real change? My partner Calvin Hughes, the only South Florida reporter in Cuba, reports live tonight from Havana. Calvin.
Lori, Governor Cuomo made history today, becoming the first American governor to visit here since the U.S. and Cuba began normalizing ties back in December. And the governor had a very busy schedule today, meeting with top Cuban government officials, and he also met with Cardinal Jaime Ortega. And he said along the way and made it very clear that New York is open for business with Cuba.
Some big news from Cuba. Pope Francis will visit the island nation on his way to the U.S. in the last week of September. That news from the Vatican just coming out today. And Local 10 is the only South Florida station in Cuba this week. So let's get to Calvin Hughes. He joins us live from Havana now with a reaction from church officials there. Calvin.
Lori, September may seem like a long time away, but church officials here in Havana began scrambling, holding an emergency meeting soon after the Vatican's announcement this morning. As you know, Pope Francis played a key role in the U.S. and Cuban governments coming together to normalize ties for the first time in decades. Egberto Escobedo serves up glasses of water to some members of the Ladies in White, outspoken critics of the Cuban government, nursing injuries they say after being attacked over the weekend following a meeting. Like them, Escobedo says, another papal visit to Cuba won't usher in change.
They say a lot of things, but in reality, the Catholic Church, I believe, has been an instrument for the Cuban government.
From Pope John Paul II to Pope Benedict XVI, their papal visits have made some sort of change here with the Church or in Cuba. Expectations are high for Pope Francis.
I think most people were curious about the Pope.
Carlos Alzugada, a Cuban diplomat and member of the Communist Party, said Pope Francis's visit to the island may be more about settling differences in the Cuban Church and supporting Cardinal Jaime Ortega.
The presence of Francis will reinforce Jaime. And as a matter of fact, Jaime should have been replaced as Archbishop of Havana some time ago. He hasn't been replaced. So he's kind, he's got a very good relationship with the Pope.
One major change after Pope John Paul II's visit in 1998, more Cubans began to openly express their faith without fear of persecution or going to prison. And the government officially recognized Christmas as a holiday. For Benedict XVI, his papal visit in 2012 led to Easter being observed as a holiday in Cuba, and a new church being built in Sandino for the first time since the revolution. Pope Francis will likely focus on Cuba's poorest, people like 77-year-old Caridad Barnett,
La leche del bebé.
who we saw today picking up food rations. At last week's Summit of the Americas, Cuba's Raul Castro gave Vatican officials at the conference the formal invitation to come to Cuba. That's after the Holy Father played a key role in bringing Presidents Obama and Castro together for diplomatic talks after decades of hostility between the U.S. and Cuba. The news of Pope Francis coming to Cuba won high praise in Havana.
I believe he's the perfect one because, A, he's Latin American. No one has to translate for him. He is outgoing and bubbly and people-focused.
Another big story that's happening here on the island. The NBA has arrived, hosting their first joint basketball camp in Havana. It's called Basketball Without Borders. The first time the NBA has sent two former players here, Steve Nash and Dikembe Mutombo. And you would think the Miami Heat, with a large Cuban fan base, would be told about this trip in advance. They apparently were not, saying they learned about the Cuban trip from news reports. So the NBA Commissioner, Adam Silver, apologized today, saying, quote, "It was a rookie mistake." We'll have much more on the NBA coming here to Cuba tonight at 11 o'clock. We have more breaking news right here we want you to see. Cuba will officially be taken off the state sponsors of terrorism list next month, exactly 45 days after President Obama made the recommendation on April 14th. Congresswoman Ileana Ros-Lehtinen confirmed today legally Congress cannot stop it from happening, and so the embassies will likely reopen in Havana and in Washington in the very near future after closing some 54 years ago. Now I'd like to show you here the newspaper today, the state-run newspaper Grandma. You can see here that the Pope's visit coming up in September is right here at the bottom, but right next to it is the talk about tourism here and how, in fact, tourism has gone up 15% from this time last year. But now we want to show you the part of Havana that most people don't get to see when they come here as tourists. It's a rare sight inside the life of many Cubans here. Let's take a look. Cuba's captivating charm is what keeps tourists coming back. From the musical sounds, the majestic sights, to the history of old Havana. It's the side of Cuba Osmaida and her daughter Delia rarely get to see. We met the single mother and nurse picking up cooking oil at a food ration stand. Only once a month, she tells me, using her blue booklet to keep track. Osmaida took us back to her one-room house. Yeah, absolutely. Mother and daughter go up a wooden ladder to the second floor. So this is how she gets up and down to her home every single day. And you have to think, what if she has groceries or books and other things that she has to carry? It's pretty tough. Her kitchen. Oh, her kitchen is outside. Her washer and dryer, she showed me. Her back, she showed me, in constant pain from this. Yeah, she's going to flush it. This is how she flushes her toilet. During papal visits, Pope Francis has built a reputation for breaking his schedule and traveling to see the poorest of areas.
The greatest way for him to learn quickly is just to talk to straight people.
If that happens, a Cuban diplomat says, está bien.
The majority of Cubans recognize that the benefits that the revolution has created are for the poor. I mean, these people here around the neighborhood who are maybe in difficult position, they have free education, they have free health care, and that's very important.
Back in Osmaida's neighborhood, not everyone is facing extreme hardship. 77-year-old Eugenio Cantillo, the kitchen, took me on a tour of his house and said,
We, the poor people, always expect things to get better. We keep waiting for things to get better. We've been waiting 55 years for things to get better.
There's a lot I want you to see here. So let me direct you down Massachusetts Avenue, that building across the street. That is, as of 12:01 this morning, the new Cuban embassy in Washington, D.C. And the crowd that you see standing inside the gate, those are some dignitaries and among 600 invited guests.
We are going to allow this moment to play out, if you will. So we're going to have you stand by in just a moment.
I'm sure there is no mistake, but these are Cuban military honor guards. They have the flag, and they are going to raise it.
An extremely very passionate showing out here. If you take a look behind me, the group you see here, Cuban exiles who are downright disgusted with the opening of the embassy and the renewed relations between Cuba and the United States. They fervently believe that Cuba has not done enough to deserve this, that the Castros have not done enough to deserve this.
Lori, work is happening around the clock at the American Embassy, getting ready for Friday's flag-raising ceremony. Luis Truba lives in Homestead, but he's back in Havana, hoping that his Cuban-born wife will land a temporary visa from the American Embassy. 4 times they've been told there's a paperwork issue.
The paperwork was missing, so she came, she brought it. They told her to come back a certain date.
Oh, so it wasn't.
She came back a certain day. They said still not ready. So it's the whole back and forth. So again, it's just to see if it's ready this time.
Truba is the face of frustration for thousands who line up every day at a park down the street from the American Embassy. Optimistic, under the suffocating Havana heat, that they will graduate to the next line outside the gates of the U.S. Embassy, all for the prize of a temporary visa. If you're lucky enough and your name is called, hope can end in heartbreak.
I see everybody has been coming out with a visa and I still don't see her out. So I'm a little nervous, but we'll see.
Luis waited and waited for his wife to return with good news, and so did we. Meanwhile, for Cubans like Samuel Echeverria, his first try for a visa denied, which means he won't get to see his 92-year-old mother in Miami. Do you want to say something to your family? Well, they will be able to see it.
Buena salud, gocen de buena salud y que los quiero mucho.
For Maria Lopez, una vez más in September. September 15th?
Yeah.
You're trying to go to where, Miami?
Yes, Hialeah.
Hialeah?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Are you going to stay or just visit family?
No,
family?
Stay.
Oh, yes! And finally, after nearly 2 hours, Luis's wife comes out of the American Embassy, and he finds out that his agonizing wait is over. I guess 4 times is the charm. Wow, so finally.
Everything's good.
So you're coming to Miami then?
Sí, que si tú vienes a Miami.
So, yes, are you happy?
Está feliz.
Yeah, you're very happy, okay. I understand. Well, we're happy for you. Thank you. Eric and JC, good morning. History being made in this very moment. The one and only Local 10 News is the very first TV station to broadcast live from the American Embassy, just hours before the American flag gets ready to go up here.
From Local 10 News, this is breaking news.
Let's take you live right now to Havana Jose Marti Airport. Breaking news, Secretary of State John Kerry has arrived, landing ahead of the official reopening of the U.S. Embassy in Cuba. Lori, let's go ahead and show you what's happening here, because typically this is what you see when you come to Versailles. Media outlets lined up. This is several networks, local and national. And then as you move here down this street on Calle Ocho, you can see some of the protesting.
And I thought about this last night, too, quite a bit, that you cannot overlook the emotion, the many layers of emotion that are involved in this story, especially in South Florida, where this story really resonates. You know, even the hardest of hardliners back there in South Florida are looking on this moment and they are saying, this is something that I never thought would ever happen in my lifetime.
What a beautiful ceremony. And I have to say, I got a little teary as I watched the Old Glory being raised there in Havana, Lori. It is a glorious sight.
We always feel that emotion as Americans, and you can only begin to imagine what Cuban Americans feel.
Well, Kevin, I can tell you at the height of the exchange, the debate was very passionate. This is an example, this flyer handed out that says, Mr. President, open your eyes and see the real Cuba. And we also saw real, raw emotions. Back and forth, offensive language from both sides. Racist, communist, cowards, and it only gets worse. An anti-Castro protester pushes down the sign of a man who sides with the changes in relations.
Nikki and Todd, good morning. The pre-ceremony continues on here. We're still hearing music and people praying in the background here. Victor, this has been going on for now a couple of hours, but we've also seen how people are waiting in great anticipation for Pope Francis to arrive here, and we're expecting that roughly in about maybe an hour, maybe a half hour or so.
Yeah, he should arrive here within minutes, riding in on the Pope Mobile, coming in from the Vatican Embassy. And we have a moment here. Go ahead, Calvin.
Live pictures here of the Pope Mobile making its way here to Revolution Plaza. And Victor, you saw this yesterday, and what an amazing view this is, knowing that this Pope is very different from the other popes who have come here, his predecessors, from Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI. Here he is 3 years after the last papal visit, but this one comes here knowing that this is Pope the diplomat who helped normalize ties between the U.S. and Cuban government. I'm joined now by our Victor Oquendo and Hatzavella. Both have been here on hand to see this exciting moment for the Cuban people, and we know tens of thousands of people have come today. The Cuban government estimates about 1 million people have come down here, but we think that's probably an exaggeration.
One of my favorite parts was when he talked about grandmothers and the role they really have played in Cuban society. As somebody who's from Latin America, it sort of extends beyond Cuba, and because from my experience, it was my grandmother who taught me how to pray the rosary, so it really speaks to the role of grandmothers, of the elderly, and religion, and what they bring and the knowledge they pass on to the younger folks.
Hatzel, you've been here many times, so you're about to get your Cuban passport, but and likewise for me, I've been here a half a dozen times. So Victor, I'll end with you, your first impressions and your overall thoughts and final thoughts about being here.
It's a place that I've wanted to come to for such a long time. Since I was born, never thought I'd be able to actually make this trip. Yeah. It's beautiful, and it's very tough to take in at the same time. There's a lot of struggle here, and it's very tough to explain. That's just the simplest way to put it. You have to come see it for yourself.
That's right. Very tough to explain. A place of conflict emotionally, and everything that you see, a tale of two cities no matter where you go. Old Havana and the real Cuba, no doubt about it. So for my colleagues, Victor Oquendo, Hatzavella, I'm Calvin Hughes. Guys, I'll send it back to you in the studio.
Local 10 News had exclusive access to crisscross the island, something no television journalists had been allowed to do for decades.
Local 10's Hatzavella and his crew spent nearly a month in Cuba. They visited all 15 provinces to capture the stories of the Cuban people, their lives today, their struggles, and the hopes for the future. Here's Hatzel with a preview of his journey.
Our journey really starts in January. When we were the only South Florida station live from Havana documenting the first ever American diplomatic visit. Since then, we've been back to the island again and again, always in Havana. So we decided we wanted to show South Florida the entire island. Welcome to the world of tobacco. We're going to take you inside a farm in one of the most important provinces of the island. We started in the westernmost province, Pinal del Rio, where we explored the area's biggest crop, tobacco. We were in Viñales.
¿Cuál pueblo es ese? Ese es Viñales.
This is Felipe Lozano, our cross-country guide. You'll see him throughout our series, always explaining the history,
Fidel entonces, de aquí.
the realities.
They don't have any freedom at all. They're in prison, like in a prison.
But also the joys of Cubans on the island. In the province of Artemisa, he's there when we get caught in the thunderstorm at a small family-owned restaurant called Baladar in Cuba. Here, we also visit the Bay of Mariel, the last thing many Cubans saw as they took to the waters of the Florida Straits.
La Bahía de Cochino.
Felipe shows us the infamous Bay of Pigs in the province of Matanzas. We also take you to Varadero, where it seems the embargo
it's not really hurting the local economy. Days into our trip, we head east to Cienfuegos. If you're Cuban, you know this song. In Benny Morez's town, you see the struggle. It's always there as we went from province to province. Like in Santi Spiritus, in the town of Trinidad, where we find 75-year-old Nena Box. Shows us her home. The retiree scrapes by without any family abroad or in Cuba. We spend time with fishermen, street vendors, and those making decent money by renting out their homes for tourists.
Estas son las campanas de los sonajeros.
Culture in Cuba is huge and very much alive, and each province offers something different. In the town of Santi Spiritus, this man has been fixing lighters for 30 years. It's how he survives. Survival is a consistent theme in Cuba. Our Cuban journey also exposes us to decades of pain. We found the very real effects of family separation. Two sisters who haven't seen each other for 45 years.
Yo todas las noches lloraba.
This is not just a Cuban story. It's the story of many who have migrated. It's a South Florida story, still unfolding.
Fue muy doloroso.
Felipe knows it too well. For years, he didn't talk or see his eldest sister, Maria, who happens to be the mother of our producer, Michelle.
Un viaje como el que nosotros hicimos, eso no lo pueden hacer mucha gente.
A trip like that, not anyone can do. You have to have human ingredients, he says. That's what we were after, the human ingredients. You'll see it on this historic, unprecedented series of stories.
Over the next 3 weeks at 6 and 11, we will bring you stories from each province on the island. Our first stop, Pinal del Rio.
Cuban migrant crisis in Central America. Day 3 of our coverage turns to the children making the treacherous journey to the U.S. by land.
Carlos, first I want to say that these gentlemen joining me in our live shot are folks who just want to make sure that their families back in Miami know that they're doing well. So I'm going to step out of the shot and you can see some of their faces. Maybe some folks will recognize them, but these are just some of the men here at this shelter, part of 400 others who are also at this shelter, whose concerns mainly are that their visas, Costa Rican visas, are expiring, and they want to know what's going to happen in the next coming days. Life in a small Costa Rican town changed fast. This is La Cruz, a town 20 minutes from the Nicaraguan border. This is it, until the Cubans started coming. We meet Yulacy Diaz and her husband, Ruben Peláez. We ask about their journey.
Estamos tristes y ellos allá igual.
We're all sad, she says, as she starts to choke up, thinking of the children she left behind in Cuba. They're 9, 15, and 29, all in the care of their godmother.
Pero bueno, para esperar para poderlos ayudar, que vivan un poquito mejor.
We have to move forward, she says. They have to wait so we can help them and they can live a slightly better life. All worth it, she says.
En Cuba la vida es muy difícil.
Life in Cuba is too rough, he says. For now, these Cubans adjust to life in Costa Rica, a country that has been welcoming to them. A town of about 6,000 all of a sudden became a town of about 8,000. At the local barbershop, business is booming. Cesar Perez, the owner, says he cannot keep count. Demand is so high, he opened up the shop today when it's typically closed. $6 will get you a haircut. Cubans like to take care of themselves, he says, and they have the cash, mostly money they get from relatives back in the States or money they made by selling what they had in Cuba. At what typically is only a store to buy milkshakes, this man buys coffee. Owner Mirta Rodriguez says she's adjusting and making extra food for the newly arrived. Business is crazy, she says. She works until late just to keep up.
Rodriguez then tells us she took in a family, a way to help.
Nosotros somos inmigrantes, igual que ellos, somos nicaragüenses nosotros.
We're immigrants too, she says. This Nicaraguan woman says she migrated to Costa Rica and knows what they're going through. She experienced it as well.
And again, the concern here is that some of their visas will be expiring soon. Those are visas that were issued by the Costa Rican government. One thing is certain, though, whatever happens to these folks, they are pretty tough when they tell you they do not want to go back to Cuba.